Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is episode 82.
You have made a mockery of the ancient laws. You've abducted them from us and made them your own. My honor has been stripped.
We don't often do Shakespeare on this program, but in Greek mythology, when the city of Athens held the world's first ever democratic trial, the losing side refused to accept the verdict and threatened to bring bloodshed to this land.
I will have my revenge. I will wreck this land. Justice! I go for justice!
2,000 years later, democracies still face the same question. What happens when losing feels intolerable?
Your treatment of me is unacceptable. We daughters of the night have suffered. We are aggrieved, insulted, defaced.
Today, American elections feel existential, sometimes because of rhetoric, sometimes because democratic norms are genuinely under strain. But what happens when one side refuses to recognize the other party's right to govern? It's a breakdown of pillars that make peaceful democracy possible.
No! You are not defeated! The result of the trial was an equal vote! You may stand proud!
2,000 years ago, the Greeks understood something we're still struggling with today. Democracy only works when losers accept the outcome and winners don't abuse their power. And that's what we're going to talk about on this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. I'm your host, David Beckmeyer, and today we're speaking with a political tribalism expert who explains how the myth of Orestes and the goddess Athena offers a roadmap for compromise.
My name is Timothy Redmond. I am an educator in Western New York. I teach at Damon University, and I also am a high school teacher who teaches AP Gov, critical thinking, and human rights. And I am a director for teacher trainings with the Academy for Human Rights.
Timothy Redmond is an award-winning educator and author of Political Tribalism in America, How Hyper-Partisanship Dumbs Down Democracy and How to Fix It. He explains how conspiracy theories and hardline rhetoric can weaken democracy, and why fixing it isn't just up to politicians, but all of us. Stay with us.
Stop cursing this land! Calm yourself! If you exile yourselves and live with foreigners, then I predict you will ache for this country like a lost lover.
A diseased lover.
No! This land will grow and become ever greater. So, your answer.
Timothy Redmond, thank you so much for making time for our little program.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, certainly the book looks like the kind of topic that our audience definitely talks about. So tell us real quick the name of the book.
The book is titled Political Tribalism in America, How Hyper-Partisanship Dumbs Down Democracy and How to Fix It.
I love it. Yeah, maybe that's the long title for our whole podcast. Yeah, and you talk about how this tribalism, and we've talked about this on the show before, how it doesn't just divide us socially, but it kind of reshapes how we see and process information. I don't know if you saw, but we had Osa Vikforce on, and she's talked about sort of the idea of knowledge resistance. Jake Mackey has kind of talked about this idea of sort of epistemic silos. So give us your sort of perspective on what this means in practice.
Sure. The way that I structured the book, when I think about epistemology, and I sort of think of the epistemological vigilance model, where it talks about you have to evaluate the sources of a claim, you have to know how to evaluate a claim, and then you have to be able to evaluate the receiver of information. And that really, I do talk about evaluating sources and evaluating claims. There's a chapter for each. But I start the book with evaluating the receiver of claims, and particularly I'm talking about evaluating ourselves and how we receive information. And that's why I start with this notion of political tribalism. And the importance of party attachments. And political scientists talk about a folk theory of democracy, which is the democratic ideal where we sort of educate ourselves on the issues, adopt our, hopefully doing so in an objective, broad manner, looking at information from both sides, objectively evaluating that information, and then coming to our own conclusions, and then identifying with a political party that best represents our views on, an array of issues. But the political tribal model sort of flips that on its head, and we start with the party, and then we adopt our issue positions from the party. And once we do that, then you're going to have all of the biases associated with motivated reasoning kick in. And so what I do after I kind of talk about political tribalism, and then I talk about the adoption, how we adopt the issues that our party adopts, and then I break it down into essentially like the thought process, how we gather information, what information we seek. That would be your information silos, selective exposure idea. Then I talk about perception and how our political tribes, political identities can even affect how we perceive information, and how Democrats and Republicans can look at the same event and see it very differently. And then I talk about how we evaluate all different kinds of information. And that's when I get into talking about how to evaluate arguments, but I also talk about evaluating news sources and evaluating, I have stuff in there about deep fakes and cheap fakes and all different statistical information, polling. And so there's a ton of stuff in there, but it all revolves around this. I'm trying to raise awareness about our own personal biases and how that affects everything that really we think about when it comes to politics.
Yeah, and we talk about that a lot. We've talked about it with a lot of different folks on this show in different ways to try to sort of identify, because it's so sort of subconscious. We don't really notice it when we're doing it, and we can sometimes see it in other people, but we just can't see it in ourselves. Right. Exactly. And so, that's one of the tools we talk about, is maybe having some trusted folks that can help you check yourself. But other than that, did you point out any sort of tricks or ideas you can use to kind of tell when you're kind of doing this? When you're kind of using one of those cognitive biases or otherwise?
Yeah, there at the end of every chapter, I sort of have a what you can do section, and so I get into a lot of those, and it's based on the chapter and what I'm discussing. So if it's evaluating political arguments, I talk about identifying the conclusion, identifying the premises, how to map out arguments, and then I get into some logical fallacies to help you be able to identify those. When I talk about media sources, I talk about bias in the media and what kind of biases are prevalent, what kind are not, and what sources are most reliable. So it really depends on the chapter. For other things like the tribalism, it's just that stuff is hard, a little bit harder, because it's sort of just being able to recognize when you start to get emotional, or when you start taking the news personally, or maybe you hear something about an elected official doing something wrong and you're really not sure who that elected official is. And if your first thought is, oh my gosh, I hope they're not a Republican, or I hope they're not a Democrat. It's little things like that you can try to make yourself aware of and hopefully catch yourself. And I've noticed, since I've become aware of this research and really started to think about this and really start to try to practice this in my own life, I'm always screwing up, but I've become much better, because the more you practice these things, the more it becomes kind of commonplace, and the more I'm able to catch myself when I'm doing it. So it does work. It's a lot of hard work, but it does work. And so I try to give little things at the end of each chapter that people could try to incorporate into their daily lives.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I've been doing this show for 3 years, and I still find myself, if I find some new person don't know much about it, I try to check as quick as I can. Are they Republican or Democrat? Right? I still do it. I can't stop. Yep.
I know.
Despite everything. Yeah. So you and others we've talked to as well have kind of talked about this idea of how these distortions undermine some of these core democratic functions, like representation and accountability. and what you refer to as loser's consent, which I think is similar to what Kevin Smith has called the loser's burden. So what do these, those kind of breakdowns and distortions look like, and how do they show up in sort of real life in real terms?
Well, I think you're starting to see it's been happening for a while. It manifests itself in things like "Not My President." You started to see that with George Bush, and then with Obama. You start to see that with conspiracy theories about elections being stolen, and all of these, ways in which one side wants to try to rationalize a loss to the other side or deny the fact that they lost to the other side. And the notion of loser's consent, political scientists say that this is really a foundational democratic principle that we have been fortunate to have for the most part throughout U.S. history, with a huge exception of being the Civil War, obviously with the election of Lincoln and the secession of some southern states. But we've grown accustomed to peaceful transfers of power. And that is what makes democracy work. Obviously, when you stop to think about it, it's the side that loses half of the country right now is going to be very upset with whatever outcome of the election takes place. And the question is, are they going to consent to the loss? Are they going to accept the fact that they lost and move on, and acknowledge that the other party won and it's their right to be in power? And that's critical. The other part of that, though, is another thing I talk about in the book is the victors need to be magnanimous, and that's something that we're losing as well. Where and this increasingly you hear presidents talk about, well, I have a mandate, even if they might win with 51% of the vote or something like that. But they always, if you win, it doesn't matter if it's by a vote. You have a mandate and you're going to impose your party's vision or your platform on the rest of the country. And that's really just not how our system is supposed to work. The Madisonian system is one of compromise, and working together, working across the aisle. And so both parties have a responsibility after every election. The winners have to reach the hand across the aisle and say, just because you lost, it doesn't mean your voice isn't going to be considered or your interests aren't going to be considered. And the people that lose the election need to acknowledge the fact that they lost and recognize that the other party is in power for the next 2 years, 4 years, whatever it might be.
Well, and that's a key part of this idea too, is just this idea that there's going to be another election. So it's like, you pick yourself up and get ready for the next one.
Yes, and I think too, things like our federal system historically has been supportive, right? If your party loses at the national level, your party still might be in control at the state level, and that helps ease the hurt of a loss at the national level too. And it's always, with midterms, usually the president's party, it's almost like clockwork throughout American history. The president's party loses seats in Congress. And so you don't even have to wait 4 years. But there's this growing, as things become more partisan, there's this existential nature to our elections now where everyone is speaking in these really dramatic terms and thinking it's the end of the world if they don't win. And that's dangerous because people start to believe that, and they, I don't know, it can really lead to a downward spiral.
Yeah, for sure. So we talked about how you make this connection between the Oresteia and loser's consent. So for listeners who might not know the story, can you walk us through that and what the link is?
Well, I'm a big fan of Greek mythology, and there's a lot of characters and stuff. So I'll try to streamline it as much as I can. If your listeners remember anything about the Trojan War, maybe there was this woman, Helen, who was supposedly the most beautiful woman in the world, and this prince from Troy takes her, and this from a king in Greece. His name was Menelaus, and so Menelaus goes to his brother Agamemnon, and he says they stole my wife, and we have to go get her back. And so this is the beginnings of the Trojan War. But to get their ships to Troy, Agamemnon, the king who was leading this military venture, had to kill his daughter, sacrifice her to the gods. And so he kills his own daughter and they go off to fight this war. Well, his wife was furious that he killed their daughter. And so this war lasts for 10 years and she's just waiting for him to return if he does return, and she wants to kill him in revenge. And so finally the Trojan War is over. The Greeks win. He comes back and sure enough, she kills him. Now, they had a son together, and the Oresteia, when that son is all grown up, she had sent him into exile. But now he's all grown up and he comes back. And the moral dilemma in the story is you sort of have these two moral principles that were important in the Greek world. One is that you should never harm a family member. And the other was that if someone harms your family member, you have to avenge that harm. And so Orestes is kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? Because he has to avenge the death of his father, but in doing so, he's got to kill his mother because his mom killed his dad, and that would be causing harm to a family member. So he goes back and he ends up killing his mom. And then there are these demon-like creatures called the Furies who start to haunt him because he committed this terrible crime of killing his mother. And so they're just following him all around the Greek world and just making his life miserable. And he ends up in Athens. And while they're in Athens, Athena comes, she's the goddess of wisdom. And so she comes and she's like, what's going on here? And Orestes and the Furies are arguing, and she says, well, why don't we just call together a group of citizens and you can both make your case and we'll make a decision. And does that sound fair to you? And Orestes says, yes, that sounds fair. And the Fury says, yes, that sounds fair. We'll abide by whatever decision you make. And so they essentially have like a trial and they go through their arguments. Orestes makes his argument, the Furies make their arguments, and then the citizens come forward and vote. And it's a real moral dilemma, right? So it's a really close vote. Athena actually has to cast the tie-breaking vote, but they side with Orestes. And when this happens so usually this story, the way that the story is interpreted is the importance of the founding of the state and having third-party punishments, because that's how you prevent this endless cycle of violence, right? Where someone from this group kills someone from the other group. Well, now someone from the other group's got to kill someone from this group, right? And it will never end. But when you have a third party, a government, a jury system, something like that, that can finally bring that to a close, right? But the thing that fascinates me about the story, and I think with the loser's consent, is when the decision is handed down, the Furies say they're not going to abide by the decision. And they said they're going to bring bloodshed to this land. And they're not accepting, right? They're not consenting. Before the whole process, Athena laid out, this is how it's going to work. You'll make your case, you make your case, we're going to vote. And they said, yes, we'll accept that decision. And then, of course, when they lost and they didn't like the outcome of that decision, they said, we're not going to accept it. And we're going to basically start a civil war. And Athena stepped forward and she said, look, you agreed to this. This was the process. It was a fair process. You agreed beforehand. But also, don't worry. Your interests are going to be respected. You are going to be very well respected here. And you don't have anything to worry about. You don't need to be ashamed or scared. And that calms the Furies down. And they said, you would be willing to do that for us? And she said, yes. And so they ultimately accept the decision. And for me, that was very telling. I think that was, and I had read this story so many times, but I never really picked up on that or saw that maybe as important because I never really thought much about the loser's consent until recently. And that really struck me. I just remember reading through that and like, wow, I never picked up on this before. And this is incredible. And you can see that the Greeks were struggling with that very issue with the establishment of democracy and people accepting the decisions when you don't like them. And I thought it was interesting. It wasn't just that getting the Furies to accept it, but the way in which Athena did that. And it harkens back to what I was talking about earlier about the victors need to be magnanimous and bring in people from the opposing side into the government, into leadership, have their concerns heard, and let them participate in the political process. And that's the thing that makes democracy work. The losers have to consent, and the winners have to be magnanimous.
So who do you think can play that role of Athena for us?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. I don't know. Um, I don't know. I think my hope is the American people. I am an optimist by nature. I think there's most people out there want it to work and believe in consenting to a loss and being magnanimous in victory. But I think a lot of times those voices aren't heard. They're crowded out by the clamor um, on social media, and then that sort of scares everybody else. Even if you're kind of more towards the middle, or when you hear the most extreme voices on the other side, it can sort of push you towards the extreme of your own side. And so I think it's just there needs to be a collective effort of the people, to say this is too important. We're not going to do this anymore. We're not going to abide by this stuff anymore. But it's tough because there's so many incentives pulling media in the other direction, pulling elected officials in the other direction. And so it's going to take a lot of work. I can't say I'm hopeful. I'm optimistic. I hope it works out, but I don't know. I don't think there's one Athena who's going to come along and save us. I think it's going to be an effort for each individual, and that's a large reason why I wrote the book, to try to help people get there.
Yeah. So, speaking of the media, and I've kind of shouted into the forest about this one a lot too. That you say that the mainstream media isn't as they're not the outlets aren't as partisan as a lot of people assume, and and like I said, I've tried to make that case as well, not very successfully.
Yes.
So what are some of the main reasons people on both sides believe it's so biased, and what does the research actually show about that?
It's fascinating. There's several reasons that I highlight. I'll just touch on a few, but one of the most basic ones is that people often don't know the difference between a news report and an editorial. And I come across this online all the time, and I think it's by people, groups trying to stir the pot. I mean, these are people who are financially benefiting from you turning away from other news sources, right? I mean, they want to tell you the mainstream news sources are biased and don't listen to them, listen to me. So there's a financial incentive for them to do this. And a lot of this I see coming from groups like that, but they would have, here a headline and, this biased newspaper, this biased TV station or whatever. And it's not, they're referencing an editorial, but they paint the entire newspaper, for example, with this broad brush. If there's a liberal or conservative editorial, and they'll post that, and then they say, the Wall Street Journal, or the conservative bias of the Wall Street Journal, or the liberal bias of the New York Times, or something like that. And it's an editorial. The editorial is a completely different department from the main news section. But a lot of people don't know that. And some polling has borne that out. They've asked people, do you know the difference between an editorial and a news report, between a journalist and a columnist? And some 26% of Americans say they don't. And those are the only ones that are willing to admit that they don't, right? So that number could be a little bit higher. So I think that's part of the problem. If you read an editorial, a liberal editorial in the New York Times, you might just think that's evidence of a liberal bias in the New York Times or a conservative editorial in the Wall Street Journal, right? So I think that's one reason. Another reason is there's different kinds of biases. So um, there's some call them different by different names, but there's adversarial bias, for example, and that's just journalists generally take an adversarial stance towards politicians and powerful people. And so if you're reading a story about your favorite politician and it's negative, they're trying to dig up dirt on that person or something like that, you might see that as a partisan bias, or they're just attacking this person because they favor this other political party. But it's just, this is what they do. If one candidate is embroiled in some kind of sex scandal or money laundering scandal or something like that, it doesn't matter what party that person's from. That's going to get covered. And it's a related bias would be a structural bias, like the media is a business, right? And they've got to get clicks, they've got to get for advertising. And so if there's some kind of salacious story or something like that, they're going to cover it. It doesn't matter if you've got a D or an R after your name. But people often see that and misinterpret those biases as a partisan bias. But I think the one that's most interesting and probably most pernicious is, and hardest to detect, is something called the hostile media effect, which is simply the bias really isn't in the media, it's in ourselves. And the way that the studies reveal this is you give the exact same article to a Democrat and a Republican, and you ask them to evaluate it, whether or not it's biased. There's no masthead on, so you don't know the source. You just give it to them. And Republicans will read it and they'll say it's a liberal bias. Democrats will read it and say there's a conservative bias, and they're reading the exact same story. And when they construct these stories, they often do so in a very balanced way. If they quote a Republican for 5 lines, they'll quote a Democrat for 5 lines. So they balance it in every way they possibly can. So what's happening is the people reading the article are bringing their own biases to it. And if you are someone who's way on the left, something that's in the center is going to be to your right. So you're going to see that as biased. And if you're way over to the right and you see something straight down the middle, because it's to your left, you're going to see it to the left. And so I think that's the most common reason, but it's also the hardest one to get people to accept. And I have done this. I do a lot of adult education programs, and I do this exercise with people, and it's fascinating because I give them 5 different articles from 5 different sources and ask them, try to identify which one is from Wall Street Journal, which one is New York Times, and they can't do it without you'll have people saying the Washington Post article is, well, this has to be from Fox News, right? I mean, this is like so slanted towards the right, and you're like, actually it's the Washington Post. And so it's very revealing. I think it's certain activities like that for people can be eye-opening. But the best research on this is they just find that the mainstream media sources have no consistent ideological bias. Sometimes they might be a little to the left, sometimes a little bit to the right, but it's minimal. And when you look at it over time, it basically cancels out. And it's so hard to get people to believe that. One, I think, again, because there's this constant drumbeat telling you that the media is biased. And then the other part, as I said, it's so hard because we're in our own heads, and it's hard to see that the bias is actually it's like the calls coming from inside the house, kind of the horror movie thing.
Right.
The bias is coming from inside our heads, and that's really hard to get people to see.
So what gives you hope that we can move beyond this kind of tribal fog that we're in, and that people can kind of rediscover a shared commitment?
Well, I guess, I think looking back at American history, there's been other times where things have been rough. And I just hope that people will see that there's a lot more that unites us than divides us, and a lot of the benefits that we get are because we live together. I'm a strong believer in the Madisonian system, and I think Madison, the way that he designed our government, it's not working as it was designed, but he truly believed that diversity was a strength. This was a huge debate at the time of the Constitutional Convention and the ratification of the Constitution. There were a lot of people saying, a country this large, that's this diverse, it will just never work. And at that time, the diversity was basically just different kinds of Christians and different kinds of lifestyles, a slave-based economy versus a mercantile-based economy, different climates. People are just like, you can't have a republic that's this large. And Madison took the opposite approach, and he said the diversity will be this country's strength, because the way that he envisioned it, no one would basically be in the majority. You were going to have all of these diverse ideas and interests, and then you'd all get together in one room. We call it a Congress, and you'd sit down in Congress, and everyone would air their ideas, and you would maybe the best ideas would float to the top, or you would have this spirited debate, and you would have to compromise and negotiate. But I think that that's the strength of diversity, is you test your ideas against the ideas of others, and it's not pretty. It's not supposed to be easy. It's supposed to be contentious. It's going to be emotional, but you keep having those conversations, and you have those clashing of ideas and opinions, and you just keep trying to move the ball forward. And I think that despite all of our differences and all of diversity, no one has a monopoly on the truth. We all need each other. We all have things that we bring to the table, both on the left and the right, and we're all better off because of it. And I hope that people will continue to see that. And people have said, well, maybe you need some kind of external threat or something like that, and that's the only thing that will unite the country. I mean, I hope we can do it without that. That we can just see the advantages of working together, and I believe there's a lot of people of goodwill who want to do that. There's a lot of organizations now, a lot of podcasts such as yours, a lot of books being published, which is just bringing these ideas forward and asking people, like, come on, we're better than this. We got to do better than this. And I hope ultimately at the end of the day, that's going to break through.
Right. And we know, again, sort of from data, that there's a much larger group that kind of doesn't want it to be this way than does. And so, yeah, there's that has to, that message has to get out there, and then it also has to become, sort of action and turned into reality. Yeah, I love it. That's very true. So you mentioned it a little bit before, and I know, this is something that I think about, but after all the research and writing that you've done, has your view of the other side changed, or how has it changed?
Oh yeah, it surely has. I found myself to be much less partisan than I used to. Once I started to really think about this and back away and read about, as you were saying, like the misperception literature, right? That people have. And I found myself to have a lot of those misperceptions about the other side, what they believe and what they look like and everything. And, you just start to, once you digest enough of that stuff, you start to realize, like, okay, I've been misled here. And that's not good. And I need to check this. And so I stopped kind of ingesting all of that hyper-partisan stuff. And also, really making an effort to talk politics with colleagues who are on the other side of the aisle than and that's been really helpful. Because again, you're sort of breaking down these stereotypes and caricatures. And so I found myself reevaluating what I think about the other side, looking more at actual data than sort of these assumptions that I had. But I also really start to see my own side like making me upset and frustrating me and falling for all of this stuff. And I really, I guess I've been saying my side and the opposite side, but I've really, I wouldn't say like I'm a centrist or not. I mean, I have opinions, but I think my opinions are kind of all over the place, and I'm willing to change them. I'm not, incredibly attached to, and I'm willing to be wrong about stuff. I think that's been a real change in myself, where I I don't think I ever recognized the warts on my own side, and I've really started to do that, and I see this political tribalism affecting both sides, and I don't like it when I see it from either side, and I can identify it quicker. I can start to identify it myself, and I think I'm much better off for it. And I'm glad I've sort of taken this journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds very similar to the journey that I've been on. It's a lot easier to have influence with those that kind of see you as on your own side than folks that aren't. We always want to spend all our energy talking, telling the folks on the other side what's wrong with them, and they're not going to pay much attention to us.
Right.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Timothy Redmond, thank you so much for making time for our show.
Thank you so much for having me. I greatly appreciate it, David.
That is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. Outrage Overload is a Connors Institute podcast. The Connors Institute for Nonpartisan Research and Civic Engagement at Shippensburg University works to disseminate high-quality, nonpartisan information to the American public around issues of societal well-being, democracy promotion, and news literacy. If you found this episode valuable, please share it or leave a review. It really helps. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.